But now we want to see how TETRA works or how does it not work. And for this question, we have here Wouter and Carlo. Both of them are founders of Midnight Blue and also have a quite long track record in breaking TETRA. So let's see what updates they have for us here. Give a
All right. Welcome everyone to this talk, the why, the how, the what, an assessment of TETRA End-to-end. We're very excited to share this research with you today. My name is Carlo Meijer, and these are my colleagues, Wouter Boxlag and Jos Wetzels, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. And we together form Midnight Blue, a specialist security consultancy firm from the Netherlands that focuses on high-end security research, mainly critical infrastructure and embedded systems. I'm guessing a fair few of you are familiar with our previous research. We labeled it TETRA Burst. But to make sure that everyone's up to speed, here's the absolute minimum amount of background that you need. So what is TETRA? TETRA is a globally used radio technology that competes with the likes of P25, DMR, Tetrapol. It was standardized in 1995 by the European Standards Organization ETSI, which is also known for GSM, 3G, 4G, 5G, GMR, and so on. TETRA is used for conventional voice communications and in handheld radios, but it's also for data communication, including machine-to-machine. The interesting thing is that it relies on secret proprietary cryptography. It's used all over the world for emergency services, in the military, and in critical infrastructure. It is not only used for voice communication, but also as a radio link for wide area SCADA networks to carry telecontrol traffic for electrical substations, oil and gas pipelines, and railway signaling. Now, TETRA security mainly consists of two components, both of which were secret. The TEA1 suite, which is used for authentication, key management, identity encryption, and remote terminal disabling, and the TEA suite, which is used for voice communication and data encryption over the air. The TEA suite consists of 7 algorithms divided by use case. Some of them are readily exportable, while others are restricted to public safety organizations within Europe or those in extra-European countries with friendly relations to the EU. And finally, there's end-to-end, which we haven't touched on 2 years ago, as it's super secretive, proprietary, and expensive. So the cryptographic algorithms that underpin TETRA security were a closely guarded secret since its inception. But since every geopolitical bloc has a TETRA vendor on its soil, it's safe to assume that they all had access to the specification. 2 years ago, we extracted and reverse engineered the cryptographic primitives of TETRA itself, but that didn't include the end-to-end features. Back then, we identified several significant vulnerabilities in the standard, on top of which we found a total of 12 CVEs in base stations, mobile devices, and microcontroller ROM code. So, briefly summarizing our findings from 2 years ago, the TEA1 cipher, which is used by emergency services in countries with, say, a less than stellar relationship with Europe, but also pretty much all private sector parties within the Schengen region, we found that it's deliberately weakened to a grand total of 32 bits, rendering a brute force attack trivial and constituting a full break of confidentiality and integrity. On top of that, for networks running on stronger cryptography, we found a keystream recovery attack that works regardless of the cipher used. It again constitutes a full break of confidentiality and integrity, but it is an active attack rather than passive and much harder to carry out in practice. Besides those, we found more vulnerabilities, but they're not relevant for today. Following our previous disclosures, a few cogs started turning. There's a new standards revision that now aims to mitigate the keystream recovery attack from the previous slide. There's been a large-scale patching effort to mitigate issues that could be fixed with a firmware update. Many parties started moving away from the TEA1 cipher, for example, through dual cipher networks, gradually migrating to TEA3. And finally, there's end-to-end encryption. That's an optional layer of encryption on top of TETRA that works independently. It's often proposed as a way to mitigate the issues in TETRA itself. However, it's expensive and its specifications are once again not open to public scrutiny. So that brings us to today's motivation. End-to-end encryption in TETRA is often used for the most sensitive use cases, such as special forces and intelligence agencies. Besides those, it's often proposed as a defense against TETRA's suboptimal air interface security, making a public and thorough assessment more relevant than ever. And finally, documents found through open source intelligence state that the Nordic countries require their next-gen end-to-end encryption solution to be compatible with TETRA End-to-end, making it clear that they plan on relying on the TETRA End-to-end design in the mid to the long-term future. Once again, we approached the NLNet Foundation, and they were happy to provide us again with funding for this project.
All right, so let's talk about end-to-end. What is this end-to-end solution exactly? Well, as might be apparent, but it's good to reiterate, there is this air interface encryption, that's a layer of encryption between the radio and the infrastructure, and then the end-to-end layer of encryption maintains encryption between radios among them, so it's not stripped off at the infrastructure. Now, this is not exactly end-to-end as you would expect it from, for instance, WhatsApp or Signal, because there is a central key management server that provides the radios with the end-to-end key material they should be using. And end-to-end is a solution for those users that really want this extra layer of security guarantees of confidentiality. And those are generally parties like special forces, intelligence agencies, maybe intervention teams. And due to the nature of those users, you can imagine that it is incredibly hard to determine which parties are actually using end-to-end. But through OSINT, we were able to identify that at least these countries, countries in Europe, in Latin America, Middle East, South Asia, are at some scale using end-to-end as a security measure. Now, end-to-end solutions are provided by multiple manufacturers. So there is the TETRA device manufacturers, and then there is parties like Sectra, which make smart cards. So we have to choose one to try to obtain an end-to-end implementation from. And the most obvious choice for us would be Motorola, because Motorola ecosystem is very familiar to us. The original TETRA burst research was carried out on a Motorola radio. So we know we have code execution on some of those devices. We know how the software stack works. And Motorola offers quite a few different ways of doing end-to-end. There is smart card-based solutions where you put a kind of SIM card in the radio by a third-party provider like Sectra. But the thing is that we will definitely not be able to get our hands on such a SIM card, and due to the nature of these smart cards, we can expect some very serious hardening to be present there. Another option is UCMs, which is a hardware module that you plug onto the mainboard of a radio that implements all the crypto. And it's a generic Motorola solution. It's also used for P25 and LTE radio technologies. And then there is the Crypto Micro, which is kind of the same thing, but in an SD form factor, and it operates through the SDIO interface. And that's more for current generation devices. So that sounds good. We searched through eBay, and we found exactly one Crypto Micro for sale. It looked all good, so we bought it. Part numbers matched, everything looked nice, the engravings were good. So let's dig into SDIO. Well, it turns out this thing was basically just a good scam per weight ratio, since it cost a couple of hundreds of euros and it did nothing. We did not get it to work, let alone in an attackable state or something. So that forced us to reconsider our choice for the platform, and we turned ourselves to Sepura. Sepura also offers multiple end-to-end options, and one of them is called the embedded end-to-end encryption system. And that caught our attention because embedded, would that be a software implementation? That would be very ideal for reversing. And this radio is also based on the OMAP L138 SoC, which is a chip that was also present in our Motorola. So we know how these things work. That gives us a nice head start in trying to reverse it. So we slapped more money on the counter. We purchased a few TEA1-enabled civilian radios. And since through previous work we already had a code execution vulnerability in these things, we got a head start here. We built tooling, a hooking framework, a patching framework, and we implemented everything that was needed to get the end-to-end implementation out of that device. How we did that is a talk on its own, and for the sake of time, we're going to skip over that. But since code execution vulnerabilities on these things is quite a biggie, you can leave a persistent implant or try to exfiltrate keys. We will show you a short demo of our RC Evo.
In this video, we demonstrate an arbitrary code execution vulnerability in Sapura Generation 3 TETRA radios. With only brief physical access, the attacker is able to take full control over the device, leave a persistent implant, and even extract nearly all secret key material. The attack only takes a second and becomes active after a reboot.
Thank you. So with that out of the way, let's dive into TETRA End-to-end, what we actually found. A little more background. The end-to-end implementations are proprietary, and they are not standardized by ETSI, like the TETRA standard itself, but by the TCCA, the Critical Communications Association. And they have several SFPG, Security and Fraud Prevention Group, recommendations that outline how a TETRA end-to-end solution should look. And we believe that this Sapura implementation is a close implementation of these TCCA recommendations. And of course, as everything in the TETRA ecosystem, these recommendations are under strict NDA. In order to obtain them, you have to sign the paperwork, but you also have to be approved by the TCCA to be a legitimate party that should get access to this. Manufacturers have access to those specs, but end users in general don't really know how end-to-end encryption works under the hood. Now, when we started preparing for this talk about a week ago, we found this document. It's a document written in 2003 by Brian Murgatroyd, the chairman of the ETSI Technical Committee on TETRA. And this document outlines in great detail, actually, how the end-to-end protocols look, down to bit-by-bit specifications of the fields used in certain parts of the protocol. And it's obvious that to the TCCA's own policies, this document should absolutely never have been public. But somehow, it did find its way to the internet. Now, with that lead, we dug a bit further, and we found 7 Chinese research papers discussing TETRA end-to-end. They even seem to have a university course that covered TETRA end-to-end. You know, this highly classified technology. And when going through these documents with a lot of Google Translate, we found that they are probably based on the original SFPG recommendations documents. And we also found a Russian publication that in turn seemed to be based more on the Murgatroyd paper. And ironically, both the Chinese and the Russian universities that published these papers are now found on sanction lists. And it's important to note that there is absolutely no indication of offensive intent in these papers. They merely discuss the technology. But the point here is that these NDAs that restrict access to how this technology works don't help at all. The only ones who don't know how end-to-end works are end users and maybe some public researchers. Now, how is end-to-end designed? When we started reverse engineering our radio, we found several E functions. And these E functions define core cryptographic concepts within the larger end-to-end protocol. And for instance, here you see the E1 primitive, which generates the key stream needed to encrypt voice traffic. And the underpinning cryptography is kind of flexible. The radio we reversed supported AES 128 and 256, which obviously are really robust cryptographic primitives. And it also supports IDEA, which is old, but still a fairly robust cipher and probably fit for purpose. Then there is the possibility of having customer algorithms. You can ask your TETRA vendor to integrate your own cryptographic primitive and use that as a basis for your end-to-end solution. And whichever primitive you pick, the E primitives, the E functions, will be implemented using that primitive, and they will transparently be available to the higher layers of the protocol. So for instance, when a radio wants to receive a traffic encryption key, that would go as follows. The radio receives an over-the-air keying message, which contains some unencrypted metadata and an encrypted buffer. And the unencrypted part contains the key encryption key identifier that should be used for decryption of the buffer. The receiving party then decrypts that and will find some more metadata, namely the traffic key identifier and the algorithm identifier. And if the decryption yields the same information as was specified in the metadata, then it's taken as a valid key. So that's the integrity check. And what we found is that for one algorithm identifier 0x87, there is an additional key processing function that's being invoked. And this processing function will reduce the effective entropy of a traffic key from 128 bits to 56 bits. Clearly, this is done for exportability reasons. Encryption up to 56 bits is not governed by Wassenaar, and as such can be freely exported. But the question here is, are asset owners aware of the fact that they are buying reduced security? So is this a covert or an overt weakening of the algorithm? We went to a lot of documents and we found that one vendor lists AES export as a supported algorithm. Now, reasonably, you should understand that that is a weakened algorithm. But for the other ones, we only found mentions of 128 and 256. And in some leaked documents, we found that internally there does seem to be a discussion of 64 or 56-bit key lengths. So it's not completely clear. However, in public tenders and RFPs, we found zero mention of weakened variants. And also, you might ask yourself whether clients are willing to pay hundreds of thousands or millions for an end-to-end encryption solution that offers 56 bits of security. So let's dive into call encryption. First, calls in TETRA are done as follows. Your voice data is given to the voice codec, which spits out encoded blocks of 137 bits each. And these bits are then transmitted over the TETRA network. And if some of these blocks are corrupted or completely garbled, that's fine. The codec will detect it and the voice quality will remain quite good. And that feature is actually used by the end-to-end encryption mechanism because it replaces some of those voice blocks by signaling blocks. We call those the sync frame. And these sync frames hold parameters needed to be able to decrypt the voice stream that follows. And these parameters are chosen by the party that initiates the communication. So you have such a sync frame. It holds the algorithm identifier, which algorithm is used here. It holds a traffic key identifier, which key should you be using, and it holds an IV that tells you how to decrypt the traffic that follows this sync frame. And it also holds a message authentication code that protects all these fields against tampering. Now, there is a weakness to this design, so let's watch a demo. I appreciate we're at a hacking conference, so I apologize for the high production value of this movie.
Hi, we're Midnight Blue, a specialist security consultancy firm. In previous research dubbed TETRA Burst, we discovered critical vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio communication standard. This time, we reverse engineered and analyzed the optional TETRA end-to-end encryption mechanism, which adds an additional layer of security on top of the regular air interface encryption. End-to-end encryption is typically used for the most sensitive of use cases, such as intelligence agencies and special forces. It is also considered a mitigation for several vulnerabilities we previously discovered. We investigated a popular embedded end-to-end implementation by reverse engineering a Sapura mobile radio. Different TETRA end-to-end implementations exist by vendors such as Airbus, Motorola, and Sectra. These may share similar issues, but have not been assessed by us yet. After a thorough security assessment, Midnight Blue found it possible to inject malicious voice traffic into legitimate end-to-end encrypted calls.
This traffic is sent without knowing the end-to-end encryption key.
This traffic is sent without knowing the end-to-end encryption key.
Let's delve into the attack. A legitimate transmitting party starts an end-to-end encrypted call by sending a so-called sync frame. This is a message that contains metadata on which key, algorithm, and initialization vector to use for decrypting the voice blocks that follow. It instructs the receiver to generate specific keystream blocks, which are combined with the encrypted voice blocks to recover the original voice data. End-to-end encrypted TETRA calls are transmitted as sequential voice blocks. In practice, the first voice blocks are often a predictable sequence of several blocks of silence. We found this to be the case on multiple common radio models from different manufacturers. When eavesdropping on an encrypted call, the attacker can reuse the intercepted legitimate sync frame. Since the first few blocks are predictable, the attacker can recover the corresponding keystream blocks. These keystream blocks can then be used to encrypt the attacker's malicious voice traffic. Additional voice blocks can be encrypted by simply re-injecting the sync frame. This allows the attacker to hijack or disrupt conversations on the end-to-end encrypted channel. Check out our website for more information on this demonstration and other research by Midnight Blue.
All right. Thanks. So, voice injection. I'm not going into full detail, but let's walk through how this works in a little bit more. So you have this sync frame, which is transmitted by the legitimate sender. Then you have the voice frames that are encrypted with keystream associated with that sync frame. Now that's a bit of a weak design, and let's, for the sake of the argument, assume that we have recovered some of those keystream blocks and the sync frame that goes with it. Then we can open a call, replay the sync frame, and then inject malicious voice traffic, which we can encrypt with the recovered keystream, which is completely indistinguishable from a legitimate end-to-end call. Now, how do we get those known keystream segments? That's basically the same question as how do we get known plain text due to the way how keystream and voice is combined. So here's 3 calls with the first few frames for each of those calls. And we found, upon investigation, that the first few frames are always the same. This is not for every radio, but for multiple radios from different brands, we've been able to confirm this. So that means that the first few frames, which play as silence, by the way, are always the same, and we thus have predictable plain text. This is some kind of quirk with the voice codec or with the call setup. We're not completely sure, but this is the phenomenon. And that means that we can get arbitrary length voice injection by just sending our sync frame, sending a few blocks of voice that we encrypt with our keystreams, and if we want to make the call longer, we just re-inject that same sync frame, and the receiving party will resynchronize to that sync frame, and you can reuse the same keystream again. Now, we also found an issue with SDS, which is a text message protocol, and that is that there is these kind of fields. It kind of resembles what we saw with the sync frame before, and there is a counter so that the receiving side can know whether a message has been received before or whether maybe messages were missed. The thing is, though, that this counter is not being protected by the message authentication code. As such, an attacker can tamper with it, and these messages are thus fully replayable once captured. Now, hold on, there is some important disclaimers to make here. We have investigated Sepura's end-to-end solution, the embedded end-to-end solution, which is, we think, an accurate implementation of the TCCA spec, but other implementations may or may not share these issues. And we have completely left out the TETRA air interface encryption so far. So, regarding that, as you know, end-to-end is a layer on top of the air interface encryption. We found several issues in AIE in the past in our TETRA burst research. One of them was fixed with an update to the ETSI TETRA standard. But let's discuss how resilient this air interface encryption actually is.
All right. Yeah, it turns out that we have something to say about the air interface encryption as well. Remember the keystream attack that we presented 2 years ago? You know, the one where that allowed us to decrypt arbitrary messages coming from the downlink that we demoed by decrypting a text message? Well, for those not in the know, I'll briefly reiterate. As an attacker, we capture a message from the air at some time t that we suspect is interesting. Then, at a later point in time, we target a victim, MS, so that's typically a portaphone, It doesn't have to be the original recipient. It can be any MS, as long as it shares key material. We overpower the legitimate signal, and then we tell the victim, oh, by the way, now is time T. Trust me, bro, I'm the infra. And then finally, we use some clever trickery, which I won't go into now, to extract the key stream associated with time T that allows us to decrypt the message. So if the above went a little too far for you, all you need to know really is successful time change means equals key stream equals message decrypted. Now, ETSI has since released a revision of the TETRA standard in which they aim to mitigate the attack. They now state that whenever an MS encounters an unexpected change of IV, so that's network time for all intents and purposes, the MS should consider, that's a literal quote, so not implementing any of this means you're still compliant with the standard. We're not off to a great start here. So the first thing is switch to a neighboring cell that meets the IV expected by the MS. In this case, the IV remains unchanged, so this is useless for an attacker. The second thing is initiate an encrypted re-authentication of the current cell using attacker-provided IV. We can't relay the authentication to the legitimate infra because the IVs don't match, so this is also useless. And then finally, switch to a neighboring cell that meets the attacker-provided IV. So now this one we can easily do. Just set up a secondary TETRA signal on another frequency and make sure that it reaffirms the IV that we want. So, okay, basically we're back to square one with extra steps. All we have to do is set up a secondary frequency and tell the MS that that's our only neighboring cell. So that would look a little bit like this. We, as attacker, we control two frequencies, and we say to the victim MS, hi, nice to have you on my cell. I've got one neighbor. It's at that frequency. And then we trigger a time change, and we make sure it propagates to the secondary frequency. Then the MS figures something's wrong. Then it switches to our secondary frequency. It may want to re-authenticate, so we could just relay the authentication to the legitimate infra because it's not encrypted. Then, once authenticated, we kick back the victim MS back to our main frequency. And finally, the authentication, if the MS wants to, we can relay it to the legitimate infra again. And finally, we work our magic to recover key stream. And we do all that in succession and again until we get all the key stream that we need to decrypt the message. So that looks a little bit like this.
Today, we are announcing several new serious vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio standard. In our previous endeavor, we presented a decryption oracle attack that applies to all TETRA configurations. In a revision of the standard, ETSI incorporated countermeasures aimed at mitigating the attack. In this video, we demonstrate an improved variant of the attack where we fully circumvent these countermeasures. The attack platform consists of a side controller, two base radios, and of course, a laptop. In normal circumstances, the two base radios cooperate to serve a single cell, but we've modified them so that they each pretend to be a distinct, separate cell. The victim receives an encrypted message, which is also captured by the attacker. We see the message says, confidential. The attacker now impersonates the infrastructure towards the victim, spoofs neighboring cell information, and tampers with the network time. Following ETSI's new recommendations, the victim device switches to the neighboring cell and enforces a re-authentication of the infrastructure. This is picked up by the second base radio, relaying the authentication handshake to the legitimate infrastructure and directing the victim back to the main cell. By repeating this process, the attacker recovers all he needs to decrypt the message. As before, the attack can also be applied to voice communication and data.
So yeah, this is how far standard revision and 2 years of tireless patching endeavor got us. Okay, so on with multi-cipher networks. If you've seen our previous presentation, you know that TEA1 is trivially broken. It only has 32 bits of net strength. So many parties that have TEA1 figured they have a problem on their hands, and they started moving away to TEA3, which seems to be much less painful to obtain licenses for these days. Now, suppose that you're running a harbor or, say, an airport. Clearly, TEA3 and TEA1 aren't compatible. And as you can imagine, providing the entire fleet of equipment with new firmware and configuration overnight is simply infeasible. So some base stations can be set up to support multiple encryption algorithms simultaneously. So what you do is you enable that feature and gradually migrate away from TEA1 to TEA3. That's great, right? So you can start with the most sensitive stuff and gradually move all the TEA1 over to TEA3. Sounds good in theory. Let's dive into the practice. But first, I have to tell you a little something about identity encryption, and it might not seem relevant, but I promise that it is. So in TETRA, we have sort of a phone number, which we call the SSI. Instead of transmitting those in plain text over the air, the SSI is encrypted using the CCK network key. To get a pseudonym, and that we call the ESI, which is then transmitted over the air. Now, suppose that we provide TEA1 and TEA3 users with distinct CCKs. So an SSI encrypted with TEA1 yields a different ESI than an SSI encrypted with TEA3. So that means you're going to get collisions all over the place, and that means TEA1 radios are going to transmit during time slots allocated for TEA3 radios and vice versa. There's no way for a recipient to distinguish between the two, so providing distinct CCKs to different user groups is simply impossible. So we conclude, and also validated in practice, that CCKs must be the same regardless of which encryption algorithm is used. This means that all we need to do is compromise the CCK is to target a single TEA1 user. Now, we know that the exact same CCK is used by all TEA3 radios. Worse, many networks don't rotate their keys, meaning that the CCK remains compromised even after the last TEA1 radio is long gone. By the way, I should tell you the CCK is typically used for most, if not all, voice communications on the network, so this is pretty bad. Turns out that vendors don't realize this, or they don't tell customers. We thought of a solution. Keep an eye on our blog, and if you're an OEM, drop us an email. But wait, there's more. Suppose you're dealing with a network that has both encrypted, so TEA1 to 7 clients, and unencrypted users, which is quite common in practice. Then we can inject an SDS message, which is sort of a text message, and by impersonating an unencrypted user, and put an encrypted user there as its recipient. The infrastructure will then encrypt that message and reflect it on the downlink. So that's a keystream. That's a keystream oracle right there. You have the exact same message, and it's coming from the downlink, but XORed with keystream. So you know the contents of the message, so you can just extract that keystream. Now, it turns out that we can make this very efficient by requesting a separate channel and then sending SDS messages in every time slot. There's one catch, though. We need to wait 23 days before the frame counters roll over, and before that time, we wouldn't be able to reuse this keystream. But let me rephrase that. If we run the attack for 23 days, we can decrypt all traffic indefinitely. Sounds better, right? So that's why it's really important to rotate keys every 23 days or less. And spoiler alert, that's quite rare in practice. Okay, that was quite bad, right? So wait till you see this. Every packet header contains a Boolean indicating whether or not it's encrypted. So we were wondering what would happen, like, what if you set that thing to 0, right, and just send it out? Well, it turns out on the uplink, not so much. But on the downlink, every MS we've seen just accepts it and just processes that message, regardless of vendor, model, or configuration. So even for your fancy Class 3 TEA2 networks with all bells and whistles, we could just go wild and inject traffic on the downlink. Also, the downlink injection is a great opportunity to obtain uplink keystream. For example, we can tell the MS, hey, you're subscribed to talk group X, and we do so in plain text. And then the MS will respond with an encrypted message don't do that. I want to be subscribed to talk group Y. The contents of that message is completely predictable, so that's another keystream oracle right there. So in practice, we found that many networks don't rotate their keys. It's pretty clear that in those situations, efficient keystream recovery attacks exist, let alone the use of default keys, which is also known to occur in practice, but those parties have bigger problems on their hand. Okay, so let's summarize the status quo. I think we can safely say that the TETRA air interface encryption is suboptimal for most use cases, to put it mildly. So we have TEA1 networks, fully compromised. We have mixed cipher networks, typically equivalent to TEA1, fully compromised. If there's no key rotation, it's probably compromised with some caveats. Then there's the new and improved keystream recovery attack. And finally, for this tiny fraction of remaining networks, there's still the possibility to just go wild and inject plain text traffic on the downlink. Speaking of traffic injection, let's spend a moment on that. Many experts, among those at ETSI, claim that traffic injection is simply impossible because we need to deal with many complicated things such as synchronization, signal modulation, interference from other devices, obtaining the right keystream, and network authentication. Well, let me settle the discussion right here.
Hi, we're Midnight Blue, a specialist security consultancy firm. In previous research dubbed TETRA Burst, we discovered critical vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio communication standard. One of the most devastating attacks against TETRA networks are so-called traffic injection attacks. This involves an attacker actively injecting malicious messages onto a legitimate network that are then accepted as authentic by recipients. The attack scenario is especially worrisome when TETRA is used for SCADA telecontrol and general automation of critical infrastructure. Open source intelligence surveys have indicated TETRA is used in such a capacity in sectors as diverse as power generation and distribution, oil and gas facilities, railway automation, and water management. We have built a lab setup based on real-world TETRA SCADA use cases at electric utilities in order to demonstrate the feasibility of such TETRA injection attacks. On the substation side, we have an RTU module connected to a circuit breaker controlling power to a little village. On the SCADA side, we have a laptop running control software to take legitimate switching actions. Both the RTU and SCADA side are connected to TETRA radio modems connected to a base station for wide area network connectivity, transparently carrying SCADA protocols such as IEC 101, IEC 104, DMP3, or others. Let's see how the SCADA side interfaces with the RTU over the TETRA link. Our demo is based on the IEC 104 protocol, but would work on any common SCADA protocol. A control message from the SCADA server is embedded into the SDS message and sent from the master radio to the base station. The base station then sends it to the receiving radio modem, where the protocol converter recovers the original control message. The RTU processes the message and executes the required switching actions. Our previous research has shown that attackers can recover keystream or even keys themselves, especially given the prevalence of the weak TEA1 cipher in critical infrastructure. The attacker then uses a modified radio which spoofs the SCADA master radio's identity on the TETRA network. Contrary to common misconceptions, the attacker has no need to register or authenticate, even on a Class 3 network. The attacker can first passively intercept network traffic to learn more about the protocols, addressing schemes, sequence counters, and data mappings used. Based on this knowledge, the attacker can then smoothly inject a malicious control message without disrupting existing data flow. In our scenario, process-specific knowledge can be obtained either through sniffing or a brute force approach similar to the In-Destroyer attacks on the Ukrainian power grid. In our demo, the attacker intercepts a legitimate control message and subsequently injects a forged message, causing a trip of the circuit breaker controlled by the RTU. This disrupts power flow to our little village. This attack scenario applies to nearly all TETRA network configurations. Check out our website for more information on this demonstration and other research by Midnight Blue.
So I believe we have a compelling argument here. In the demo you just saw, we injected an SDS message on behalf of the SCADA control room in order to trip a circuit breaker. I should stress that this is on the more innocent side of the attack spectrum. Messages coming over the TETRA link are typically trusted, and therefore there are opportunities for persistent implants and lateral movements, such as sending a malicious firmware update. So that brings us to the conclusion today. We are the first to perform a public analysis of TETRA End-to-End solution. We uncovered weakened variant, which clearly exists to comply with the Wassenaar arrangement. It seems not to be clandestine, but also vendors aren't shouting it from rooftops. Make of that as you will. In our specific implementation, confidentiality is okay, but integrity and authenticity has problems. Once again, the secretive nature of end-to-end specification has resulted in all major geopolitical blocks being in the know of the specs and end users scraping in the dark. We're confident to say that these issues would have been found much sooner if only the specs were public. And besides end-to-end, we once again found a number of serious issues in the air interface. And I'd like to end this talk with some recommendations. Don't trust black box solutions. Time and time again, it turns out that the actual security guarantees are much different than those advertised. Don't blindly trust vendor claims. Perform an in-depth technical analysis before procurement. If you're about to commit to a certain technology for several decades and spend literal millions of dollars, the least you can do is to have independently assessed before you do. Finally, we believe it's time to pressure vendors for transparency. It shouldn't be your responsibility to assess what the real security guarantees of our technology are through tedious reverse engineering. And with that, so if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them now.
Yes, thank you. And we have here in the room, in the front, a microphone, and in the back, a microphone. Please queue if you have any questions. And also, we have questions from the internet. So if you watch the screen, the stream, then you can go with your IRC client to the OFTC server, and there you find the Y25 Andromeda channel and can ask the questions here. So, but first questions.
Someone paid attention.
I really like the analysis you did. You did a great analysis. Very surprising. This seems like the kind of thing that TLS does correctly. What would you say about why don't we get rid of all of this and switch basically everybody using TETRA over to TLS? Would that be a fix?
Yeah, so we are always proponents of using properly public and well understood and vetted crypto. So that's definitely a great idea. If you're using TETRA in a data carrying capacity, indeed, it would be wise to use some kind of VPN or a TLS tunnel or something to not rely on the TETRA air interface encryption or even the end-to-end encryption. However, in the case of voice communications, that becomes a bit difficult because those radios don't really have support for TLS inside the handset, so that would require major rework. But yeah, if you're using TETRA as a modem, that would definitely be a great idea.
Thank you.
In 2023, Gert Roelofs came out and confirmed that the backdoors were in there on purpose. Isn't this being on purpose still the reason for the lack of transparency in all of those TETRA algorithms?
Yeah, so
what's your suspicion on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is. This is speculating. This is all speculation. The real answer is I don't know. So what we found is what we found. There's a key reduction step there. It's 56 bits. We also know that it's like mandated by the Wassenaar arrangement if you want to export that. There is some mentioning in materials coming from manufacturers that say like, okay, this is AES export, but they don't seem to be shouting it off rooftops. The answer is they're quite silent about it, and perhaps someone who just figured out that they're using a backdoor cipher also isn't really willing to like make that public. So the real answer is we don't really know. But again, I would just like to stress the fact that like, would you be in non-Western government and spend literal millions of dollars on a solution that provides you with 56 bits of encryption? Seems unlikely.
Okay, but one more remark on that. Gert Roelofs is the person that worked at DNO at the development of TETRA 1, and he confirmed officially that he's now retired, so it's safe to speak about it. And he confirmed that it was in opdracht van, or admitted by the
on behalf
of the government to weaken the encryption key.
Yeah.
That's not speculation.
Yeah, in that case, that's right. Okay. But in this case, we simply don't know. But again, there's Wassenaar, and that states 56 bits. TA1 was much weaker. It's a different scenario, because TA1 is much weaker. And also, it advertises 80 bits of security, and also you need an export license in order to export TA1. So there's this whole charade around TA1 that it's supposed to be strong.
Yeah, to the best of our knowledge.
To the best of our knowledge, right.
Okay, thank you.
We all deal with a lot of technology which is very well protected. TLS and stuff is like all pretty good security. Why do you think that there is such a distinction between Wassenaar dual use technology and then the other technology? It's not like all of these countries wouldn't have access to secure technology. Why is some of this stuff covered on the Wassenaar and some of the stuff just not covered on the Wassenaar?
Well, I think we are maybe not the best party to ask this question, since we're certainly not lawyers. But it seems that Wassenaar has all kinds of clauses, including certain applications into being covered under export laws and excluding others. Conceivably, these kind of strategic communication systems might fall under Wassenaar in any case, but public crypto is exempt. I'm not completely sure. You'd have to ask someone with a legal background, preferably in this area, for that.
Okay, so do we have questions from the internet? I hardly can see my signal angel. No questions from the internet. No one trusts to send questions about this on IRC. Do we have more questions here? It doesn't seem so, but I'm sure a lot of people have questions, so can directly address you and to find out more about the details here. So again, a big applause. And let's see what kind of update we get in 4 years, how much it's better or more broken than it was today.